Hey, everybody! Welcome back to the channel. And today we're gonna pick up from chapter 7 that we read last time, and start chapter 8. So this one is, if you remember the last chapter, Karlson and Smidge. Well, Karlson was discovered by Miss Crawley, the maid, and that's where we left off. So. Let's see what happens next. This chapter is called Not a Ghost, Just Plain Karlson. Chapter 8. It turned out to be an evening Smidge would never forget. Miss Crawley sat on a chair, crying, and Karlson kept well away from her, looking almost ashamed of himself. Nobody said anything. It was all a big mess. This is enough to give me lines on my forehead, thought Smidge, because that was what Mum sometimes said. It was like when Seb came home the day he'd failed 3 subjects at once, or when Sally kept nagging about wanting a fur jacket, just when Dad had the new television set to pay for. Or when Smidge threw stones in the school playground and broke a window. Then Mum had sighed and said, "This is enough to give me lines on my forehead." That was exactly how Smidge felt now. Oh dear, how horrible everything was. Miss Crawley was crying buckets of tears. And why? Just because Karlson wasn't a ghost. "That's my ghost program gone up in smoke," she said, glaring at Karlson. And just when I'd said to Frida. She buried her face in her hands and cried so loudly that nobody could hear what she'd said to Frida. "But I really am a handsome, thoroughly clever, perfectly plump man in his prime, you know," Karlson said, trying to console her. "I wouldn't mind coming along and being in that box, maybe with some little princess or other." Miss Crawley took her hands away from her face and looked at Karlson. She gave a scornful snort. "Handsome, clever, perfectly plump man. That's just the sort of thing to interest them when TV's already full of them." She gave Karlson a cross and mistrusting look. "That little fatso, he must be a boy, mustn't he? Even though he looked like a small man." She asked Smidge, "Who is this character? Tell me that." And Smidge answered truthfully, "He's someone I played with." "I thought as much," said Miss Crawley. Then she started crying again. Smidge was amazed. There were Mum and Dad thinking that if anybody ever caught a glimpse of Karlson, there'd be a huge hullabaloo, and everyone would come rushing and want to put him on television. But the only person who actually had seen Karlson was crying and saying he was worthless because he wasn't a ghost. The fact that he had a propeller and could fly didn't impress her at all, actually. Karlson was at that moment flying up to unhook his ghost outfit from the light, but Miss Crawley just glowered at him more crossly than ever and said, "Propellers and gadgets, and I don't know what else. All the things kids expect these days. Suppose they'll be flying to the moon soon, before they've even started school." She sat there, getting crosser and crosser, as she started to realize exactly who had pinched the buns, as well, and mooed outside the window, and written the ghost writing on the kitchen wall. Fancy giving children gadgets that meant they could fly about and tease old folks like that. All the hauntings she'd written about to the television company were nothing but boys' pranks, and she couldn't bear looking at that fat little good-for-nothing a minute longer. "Get off home, you there, whatever you're called." "Karlson," said Karlson. "I know that," said Miss Crawley, in exasperation. "But surely you've got a first name, too." "Karlson's my first name and my last name," said Karlson. "Don't you provoke me and make me cross, because I already am," said Miss Crawley. "First names, they're what people call you. Don't you know that? What does your father call you when he wants you for something?" "Little devil," said Karlson smugly. Miss Crawley nodded approvingly. "He never said a truer word, your father." And Karlson agreed with her. "Oh yes, when I was little I certainly was a little devil then, but that was a long time ago. These days I'm the world's best behaved Karlson." But Miss Crawley wasn't listening any longer. She was sitting quietly thinking things over and seemed to be calming down a bit. "Well," she said at last, "I know one person who'll be pleased about all this, at any rate." "Who?" asked Smidge. Frida, said Miss Crawley bitterly. Then she vanished into the kitchen with a sigh, to mop up all the water and put the bowl away. Karlson and Smidge thought it was nice to be on their own. What a fuss some people make about little things, said Karlson and shrugged. What have I ever done to her, eh? Nothing, said Smidge. Only irritated her a bit, perhaps. But we'd better behave ourselves now. Karlson thought so too. Of course we'll behave. I'm always the world's best behaved Karlson. But I have to have some fun. Otherwise you can count me out. Smidge thought about it and tried to come up with something Karlson would enjoy. But he didn't need to because Karlson did it for himself. He rushed into Smidge's wardrobe. Hang on, I saw a funny thing in here when I was a ghost. He came out clutching a little mouse trap. Smidge had found it when he was staying in the countryside at Granny's and brought it back to Stockholm with him. Because I really would like to have a catch. I would really like to catch a mouse and tame her and have her as a pet, Smidge had explained to Mum. Mum said city flats didn't have mice, thank goodness. Or theirs didn't, at least. Smidge told Karlson this, but Karlson said, a mouse nobody knows about might come along. A little surprise mouse who comes pattering in just to make your mum happy. Karlson told Smidge how great it would be if they could catch that surprise mouse, because then he could keep her up in his house on the roof, and if she had babies, he'd eventually have a whole mouse farm. And then I'll put an advert in the paper, said Karlson. If it's mice you need, then ring Karlson's mouse farm right away. Yes, and then even city flats can have mice, said Smidge happily. He showed Karlson how to set the trap. But you have to have a piece of cheese or bacon in it, of course, or no mouse will come. Karlson put his hand in his back pocket and pulled out a little piece of bacon. It's just as well I have saved this at dinner time, instead of throwing it down the rubbish chute. He hooked the bacon rind into place and put the mousetrap under Smidge's bed. There. Now the mouse can come whenever she likes. They had almost forgotten Miss Crawley, but at that moment they heard her bashing about in the kitchen. It sounds as if she's cooking something, said Karlson. She's making frying pan noises. And he was right. There was soon a delicious smell of meatballs finding its way out of the kitchen. She's frying the meatballs left over from dinner, said Smidge. Oh, it makes me feel hungry. Karlson dashed to the door. Off to the kitchen with a leap and a bound, he cried. Smidge thought Karlson was very brave, daring to go in there, but he didn't want to let the side down either. He followed cautiously. Karlson was already in the kitchen. Woohoo! I think we're just in time for a light supper. Miss Crawley was standing at the stove, shaking the pan of meatballs, but when she saw Karlson, she put it down and came towards him. She looked cross and threatening. Get lost, she shouted. Out with you, right now. Karlson's mouth drooped, and he put on his sulky look. You can count me out if you're going to be such a sourpuss. I'm entitled to have meatballs too, aren't I? Don't you realize how hungry it makes you zooming around, haunting all evening? He dodged towards the stove and snatched a meatball from the frying pan. But he shouldn't have done that. Miss Crawley let out a roar and came straight for him. She picked him up by the scruff of his neck and dumped him outside the kitchen door. Get lost, she shrieked. Go home and don't stick your nose in here ever again. Smidge was absolutely furious and in utter despair. How could anybody do that to his beloved Karlson? How can you be so horrible, he said, feeling the tears welling up inside his throat. Karlson's my friend, and he's allowed to be here. He got no further before the kitchen door opened. In stomped Karlson, and he was hopping mad, too. You can count me out, he shouted. You can count me out if this is how it's going to be. Think you can throw me out of the back door like that? Then count me out, that's all. He went up to Miss Crawley and stamped his foot on the floor. The back door. I want to be thrown out the front door like other posh people. Miss Crawley grabbed the scruff of his neck again. By all means, she said. And despite Smidge running after her, crying and protesting, she carted Karlson off through the flat and heaved him out of the front door. So he got what he wanted. There, she said, is that posh enough for you? Yes, that's fine, said Karlson, and Miss Crawley slammed the door behind him with such a force that the whole building shook. At last, she said, and marched back to the kitchen. Smidge ran after her, arguing. Oh, come on, that's really mean and unfair. Of course Karlson's allowed in the kitchen. And he was, too. Then Miss Crawley and Smidge got there. Karlson was standing by the stove, eating meatballs. Yes, I want to be thrown out of the front door naturally, so I can come back in through the back door and get myself some yummy meatballs. Then Miss Crawley picked him up by the scruff of his neck and threw him out for the third time, this time the back way. This is getting ridiculous, she said. You're a bad penny and no mistake. But if I lock the door, then maybe we'll be rid of you at last. We'll have to see about that, said Karlson mildly. The door closed behind him, and Miss Crawley made sure it was properly locked. You really are being horrible, said Smidge, but she wasn't listening. She was on her way to the stove, where the meatballs were sizzling appetizingly in the pan. Maybe I can finally have a meatball myself, after all I've had to put up with this evening, she said. Then they heard a voice from the open window. Good evening. Anyone at home? And are there any meatballs left? And there sat Karlson on the window ledge, beaming at them. Smidge burst out laughing. Did you fly over from the balcony? Karlson nodded. Certainly did. So here I am again, expecting everybody's glad about that, especially you there over by the stove. Miss Crawley was poised with the meatball in her hand. She had been about to pop it into her mouth, but when she saw Karlson, she stood there, gaping. Never seen such a greedy girl, said Karlson, and dived down on her. He snatched the meatball as he zipped past and flew briskly up to the ceiling. But then Miss Crawley snapped back into the action. She let out a little shriek, grabbed a carpet beater, and ran after Karlson with it. You wretched mischief maker, I'll drive you out. You see if I don't. Karlson jubilantly circled the ceiling light. Woohoo! Time for another tussle, he shouted. I haven't enjoyed myself this much since I was little, and Dad chased me for miles around Lake Malaren with a fly swatter. We did have fun. Karlson whizzed out into the hall, and a mad chase around the flat followed. First came Karlson in midair, chuckling and hooting with delight, then Miss Crawley with the carpet beater, and Smidge, and finally a wildly barking Bumble. Miss Crawley was right behind Karlson, but whenever she got too close, Karlson put on a burst of speed and soared up to the ceiling, and however Miss Crawley brandished the carpet beater, she never did manage to do more than brush the soles of his boots. Naughty, naughty, said Karlson. No tickling my feet, that's against the rules. Watch it, or you'll have to count me out. Miss Crawley puffed as she ran, and her big, broad feet pounded on the parquet floor. The poor woman hadn't even had time to get her stockings and shoes back on, what with all the haunting and chasing they'd had that evening. She was getting exhausted, but she wouldn't give up. Just you wait, she cried, still in hot pursuit. Every so often she leapt into the air and tried to reach Karlson with the carpet beater, but he just roared with laughter and dodged aside. Smidge was laughing too. He couldn't help it. He laughed so hard that he made his tummy ache, and as they charged through his room for the third time, he collapsed onto his bed for a little rest. He lay there, quite worn out, but still couldn't help giggling as he watched Miss Crawley chasing Karlson around the flat. Woohoo! Cried Karlson. I'll give you a woohoo, puffed Miss Crawley. She wielded the carpet beater furiously, and finally managed to drive Karlson into a corner by Smidge's bed. Ha! Shouted Miss Crawley. I've got you now. Then she let out such a howl that it quite deafened Smidge. He stopped giggling. Oh no, he thought, he's trapped. But it wasn't Karlson who was trapped. It was Miss Crawley. She'd got her big toe caught in the mousetrap. She pulled her foot out from under the bed and stared dumbstruck at the peculiar object dangling from her big toe. Oh no, said Smidge. Hang on, I'll get it off for you. Sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Ah, repeated Miss Crawley, once Smidge had helped her get free, and she finally found her tongue. "Why have you got a mousetrap under your bed?" Smidge felt genuinely sorry for her and stammered desperately. Because we wanted to catch a surprise mouse in it. Not quite such a big one," said Karlson. "More of a sweet little one with a long tail." Miss Crawley eyed Karlson and groaned. You are getting out right now." And she set off after him with the carpet beater all over again. Karlson flew out into the hall, and off they raced again, into the sitting room and out again, into the kitchen and out again, into the big bedroom and out again. Miss Crawley launched herself into an extra high leap to swat him out of the air with the carpet beater, but she'd forgotten all the pieces of furniture she'd abandoned just inside the bedroom door, and as she jumped, she tripped head over heels over the little bookcase and landed with a crash on the floor. "Oops, I bet this is going to mean another earthquake in northern Norland," said Karlson, but Smidge rushed anxiously over to Miss Crawley. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Oh, poor Miss Crawley." "Help me onto the bed," Miss Crawley managed to say, and that's what Smidge did, or at least he tried. But Miss Crawley was so big and heavy, and Smidge was so small, he couldn't do it. Then Karlson came flying down. "Now, hang on," he said to Smidge. "I want to be in on the lugging too, you know, seeing as it's me who's the kindest person in the world, not you." The two of them really put their backs into it, Karlson and Smidge, and they finally managed to heave Miss Crawley onto the bed. "Poor Miss Crawley," said Smidge. "How are you feeling? Does it hurt anywhere?" Miss Crawley lay there and considered the matter. "Well, I'm sure I haven't an unbroken bone left in my body," she said finally. "But it doesn't actually hurt anywhere, or only if I laugh." And then she began laughing so much that the whole bed shook. Smidge looked at her in alarm. What was the matter with her? "Say what you like," said Miss Crawley. "I've run a couple of good marathons this evening, and lordy, how they pep you up." She nodded energetically. "Just wait. Frida and I go to keep fit classes, and you wait for the next session. I'll show Frida someone who can really run." Karlson said, "Take the carpet beater with you, and you can chase Frida all around the gym and pep her up too." Miss Crawley glared at him. "Be quiet when you're talking to me. Shut up and go fetch me some meatballs." Smidge laughed delightedly. "Yes, running really does give you an appetite," he said. "And guess who's the world's best meatball fetcher?" said Karlson. He was already halfway to the kitchen. Then Karlson and Smidge and Miss Crawley had a lovely little supper sitting on the edge of the bed. Karlson came back from the kitchen with a loaded tray. "I saw there was some apple cake and custard, so I brought that too, and a bit of ham and cheese and salami, and some pickled gherkins and a few sardines, and a bit of liver pate. But where in the world have you hidden the cream cake?" "There is no cream cake," said Miss Crawley. The corners of Karlson's mouth dropped. "So we're meant to get full up on a few meatballs and apple cake and custard and ham and cheese and salami and gherkins and a couple of mangy sardines, are we?" Miss Crawley looked him straight in the eye. "No," she said firmly. "There's liver pate too, you know." Smidge couldn't remember food ever having tasted so good. And they had such a nice time, he and Karlson and Miss Crawley, sitting there, the three of them munching away. But all of a sudden, Miss Crawley cried, Lordy, Smidge is meant to be in quarantine, and we've gone and let that one in." She pointed at Karlson. "No, we didn't let him in. He came in by himself," said Smidge, but he was still worried. "Hey, Karlson, what if you were to get scarlet fever now?" Said Karlson, who had his mouth full of apple cake and couldn't answer for a while. "Scarlet fever? Anyone who's had the world's worst case of bun fever and lived to tell the story can survive anything." "Bother, that didn't work either," said Miss Crawley with a sigh. Karlson popped the last meatball into his mouth, then licked his fingers and said, "I don't think much of the portions in this house, but I like it here otherwise. So perhaps I'll put myself in quarantine here too. Heaven preserve us, said Miss Crawley. She glowered at Karlson and at the tray, which was entirely empty of food. Not many leftovers when you come around, are there? She said. Karlson got to his feet. He patted his stomach. When I've finished, I leave the table, he said. But that's the only thing I leave. Then he turned his winder. His motor began to whir, and he flew heavily towards the open window. Hasten, Hobson, he cried. You'll have to manage without me for a while. I'm in a rush now. Hasten, Hobson, Karlson, said Smidge. Have you really got to go? So soon, said Miss Crawley grimly. Yes, I've got to hurry now, cried Karlson. Otherwise, I'll be late for my evening meal. Whoop, whoop. And he was gone. That's the end of chapter 8. A wonderful chapter. It seems that Miss Crawley and Smidge and Karlson have started to get along, and also having some fun in their apartment. So I hope you enjoyed, and please tune back in for chapter 9, next chapter.